Shalom Aleichem. We're exploring the Sicha of volume 15, Likutei Sichos, the Sicha of Noach number 3, regarding the prohibition of a Gentile observing Shabbos and what's the meaning of that prohibition. The Rebbe brings down from the Gemara, other sources, that there's that Akum Shabbos, a Gentile who observes Shabbos, it's not a mitzvah, it's actually a sin. It's considered a capital offense, which indicates that it's not their thing. In general, when Torah speaks of capital offense, it means that this is contrary to your purpose, which parenthetically explains why capital offense is described many, many times in Torah and also in the oral Torah, many times in Ethics of Our Fathers, Pirkei Avot. They'll tell us that if someone does this or that, they stop studying Torah and they admire nature. It's a capital offense, and clearly it doesn't mean in a legal sense, but it represents that it's contrary to the purpose of life, and therefore it's akin to death itself. So it's a very big statement that a Gentile and Shabbos don't go hand in hand. It's a capital offense. It's contrary to who they are, to their purpose. Where is it derived from? It's derived from a verse in today's Torah portion, which is interesting. Shabbos wasn't even given yet. You would expect it to be derived from a verse in Exodus. After the Torah was given, Hashem says, I want you to keep Shabbos. It's a covenant that I have between me and the Jewish people. Aha! If you come along and say, it's for Jews, it's not for Gentiles. In fact, there is such a source in the Medrash, another classic comment at Oral Torah, which does quote a verse from Exodus in the story of the manna, where Moses tells the Jewish people, in the name of Hashem, Re'u ki Hashem nasan lachem es haShabbos. See that God is giving you the Shabbos. Says the Medrash, he's giving it to you and not to the Gentiles. That's where the Medrash derives of this law that a Gentile should not rest on Shabbos. That makes sense. In Exodus, after Shabbos is given and is given to the Jews as a gift. However, the Gemara, the Talmud, and the Medrash too, as an added source, derive it from our Torah portion in Noach, post-flood. There's no Jewish people yet to speak of. There's no Shabbos to speak of. And where did they derive it from? They derive it from a verse that says, Lo yishbaisu, that nature should not cease, which is the same root as Shabbos. Yishbosu, Shabbos, nature should not rest. That because after the flood, when God made the covenant, he'll never again destroy the world. God said that from now on, all the seasons will continue, and day and night, and nature will run its course. By the flood, God did a reset. God, first of all, stopped the whole world and the seasons throughout the entire period of the flood, which apparently lasted for a whole year, not just the 40 days and nights that were physically flooding, but the whole year that they were in the ark. Apparently, it seems that nature there were no seasons. And the sun and the moon and the stars, the constellations, they weren't doing their job. Everything was on pause. And now, when God restarted the world, so to speak, God said God made a covenant that from now on, it's all systems go. Nature will run its course, and day and night, and Shabbos and weekday, and months and seasons and years. This will never stop. There's no more business of interrupting the schedule. All of these will never cease. On that verse, says the Talmud and the Medrash, in the Medrash case as a secondary source, that we derive that a Gentile is not supposed to rest on Shabbos. What's the connection? We're talking about nature not resting. What's the connection of a Gentile not resting? Now, according to some commentaries, like Rashi, who see the prohibition of a Gentile observing Shabbos as the Torah simply wants them to keep working, they shouldn't really take any real breaks, doesn't mean they can't take a rest, but that they shouldn't stop being productive. So then we could fit it into the context of post-flood. How? Post-flood, God says, promises, and in a covenantal way confirms that nature will continue to produce and will always be productive. All the sun, the moon, and the whole system, the seasons. So that includes the humans, because the humans are part of that food chain. They're also supposed to be continually productive, and therefore it would somehow fit contextually with this statement of Hashem. But according to Maimonides and according to the Medrash itself, which over there it's clearly indicated that the reason for the meaning of the prohibition against the non-Jews' Shabbos observance is not so much that they should always be productive, but that they should not have the spiritual, religious aspect of Shabbos or any day of the week as a Shabbos, but that's what's being proscribed from them. They're not allowed to have a holy day of abstention from nature. If that's the case, that's a religious conversation. It has nothing to do with the post-flood confirmation of Hashem that nature should continue to run its course. So how would we derive it from there? What's the connection? That's the first question of the Rebbe. Then the Rebbe asks a fundamental question. Why should the Gentile not keep Shabbos? Shabbos doesn't seem to be a uniquely Jewish thing. It's a universal thing. It's a commemoration of creation and the fact that Hashem created the world and rested on the seventh day, reminding us that the world didn't come by itself, God forbid, but there's a creator, and therefore we have to serve him and believe in him, what have you. That's not just a Jewish thing. The Gentiles have to do it too. The first mitzvah, the 7 mitzvahs of Noach, the universal mitzvahs, it's for every person to know there's a creator. So why shouldn't they have Shabbos? If you tell me that a Gentile shouldn't have Pesach, it makes sense because they didn't have Exodus. Or Shavuos, it makes sense. They didn't have Sinai. But Shabbos, they don't have creation? Creation is a universal thing. These are the two questions the Rebbe poses about the relationship of Gentiles to Shabbos. A, why is that prohibition derived from the post-flood? It's seemingly not related to the subject matter of the post-flood. It's some kind of Shabbos holiness matter. What's the connection here? And B, why, in fact, is it prohibited? So to introduce it, the Rebbe brings in a whole topic of understanding the meaning of the flood. I recommend let's minimize that window of those two questions. We'll get back to them at the end of the Sicha. But here's the body of the Sicha itself. What is the meaning of the flood? The Rebbe says, it's a big question. Why did God decide to destroy the world with a flood, only to then make a vow that he'll never do it again? God don't make mistakes. God knows the future. So if he made a vow never to do it again because he doesn't like that idea, why did he do it in the first place? And if he did it in the first place because these people are sinners and wicked, they deserve it, so why did he vow never to do it again? So clearly something changed in the interim. The world fundamentally changed, whereas pre-flood, the world needed a flood and deserved it or what have you. It was the right thing to do. And post-flood, it will never again be needed. It will change fundamentally so that it will never again need a flood. What happened? So the Rebbe introduces the difference between pre-flood and post-flood by introducing a third step, and that's going to be the Sinai step. And that's going to be the makeup of the body of this Sicha, the 3 phases, pre-flood, post-flood, and the Sinai era, beginning with Abraham and Sarah and leading up to Har Sinai, to the beginning of the Torah. What is the significance of these 3 steps? Well, let's start with the Sinai. We know the purpose of Sinai is to connect heaven and earth, to connect God and the world. And that's why only after Sinai can the physical object with which we do a mitzvah literally become holy and divine. Pre-Sinai, we could just do holy things symbolically with the physical. But heaven is heaven, God's world, and earth is earth. Post-Sinai, you take a piece of animal hide and you write on it, and suddenly it's a holy object. It becomes a Torah scroll or a mezuzah or a tefillin, literally. And every time we do a mitzvah, we're literally touching the divine, etc. So that is the theme of Sinai, the breaking of that barrier and the marriage of heaven and earth, of God and the world through the Jewish people. And obviously a precursor to the ultimate unification of heaven and earth when it's completed through Mashiach. We're trying to combine these 2 worlds. So to get to that third phase where those 2 are combined, we have first the first phase, which emphasizes the top-down relationship. We have the second phase, which emphasizes the bottom-up relationship. And then we have Sinai, which brings the 2 of them together. What do I mean? That's the model of this conversation. Pre-flood, it's all top-down. It's all, the world is operating under the impression of heaven. Post-flood, the world is operating under the impression of its own individuality, of earth. And then Sinai will marry the 2. Now, why do we need these 3 steps? Why can't we just go straight to Sinai? So it's explained that, by way of analogy, think about parenting. So some people, let's say you're a very, very wealthy man, and your wish is for your child to live a comfortable life. And you have all the money in the world, you're Rockefeller. So you can gift your child access to the funds, and he or she will live happily ever after and live in a lap of luxury. They got plenty. The second model is you may be Rockefeller, but you decide, I'm not giving my kid access to the funds. No. I'd rather they develop their own skills and they make it on their own, and I'll teach them a few skills, and then the child goes ahead and develops their skills and works and builds himself up and makes a life for themselves. Not a Rockefeller life, but a decent living. This is just a poor analogy. It's my own analogy, but I think it's very, very helpful and instructive here. I'm borrowing the analogy from analogies that are brought in Chassidus. So the first instance, the parent who's just giving him access to the funds, the kid's going to be living a much wealthier life because they have access to the giant funds. But they never become stable. And they're rich until they squander all their money and then they got none. Because they didn't learn how to replenish, and it never became them. In the second instance, they will never be Rockefeller, probably, because not everyone becomes Rockefeller. They'll always be like mediocre. However, they will have achieved it, and therefore they're in good standing. They have a bad day, if they lose some money in the stock market, they can rebuild. They have become firm. They have become established. They're not just living the good life by virtue of their parent or somebody else who is gifting them, who's giving them grace, who's gracing them with a free ride, with blessings. No, they have learned how to live. And therefore, they may not be living on that high life, but they'll always be okay. Whereas the other child, the other kid, he'll probably live the high life for a while until he messes up something big, and he'll probably become poverty-stricken. So this is a pretty decent analogy to what the Rebbe is trying to say. That the first 1,000 years of creation, pre-flood, Hashem gave the world abundance of divine energy and divine blessing. But the world didn't earn it in any which way. And therefore, on the one hand, there was tremendous blessing. People lived 1,000 years. 1,000 years. And why not? If you're living on the rich man's credit card, Hashem was shining his light. They lived for very, very long times. It was tremendous blessings. Whereas after the flood, God said, no, the world has to earn its own keep. So for the first 1,000 years, the world didn't deserve that blessing. It just got it for free. And whereas after the flood, the world deserved it. The world was refined. And that's what the mikveh accomplished. The flood was like a mikveh. The 40 days of the flood were like the 40 measurements of the mikveh, the 40 saw. And now the world is fundamentally changed. It's like in the analogy of the parent, he calls the kid back home. He takes away the credit card, the keys to the vault or whatever, and instead immerses the child in the serious education. It's going to probably be hell for the kid. It's going to feel like he's being put through the flood of Noach. But you know what? In the end, he'll come out the better for it. He'll be a person. He'll be a mensch. He'll never be so rich. But he will be a mensch. So, says the Rebbe, take a look at pre-flood and post-flood. Pre-flood, because it's a free ride. People live for a very long time. Tremendous blessing. But the blessing doesn't belong to the world. Therefore, the world is a very weak place in the sense that it could disappear. And it did. There were no guarantees. I like my analogy. It's a perfect analogy. It's a pretty good analogy. It's not perfect, but it's a pretty good analogy. Just like here, the kid has access to the riches. But it could disappear because he can squander it. He can make one bad mistake. He doesn't have the tools. He doesn't know what it means to work a hard day. And therefore, he has riches until he doesn't. And that was the first 1,000 years of creation. The world was such a blessed place. But in and of itself, it was a very weak place. It was only blessed because of the benefactor, namely Hashem. But it was a weak place in the sense that we don't know what tomorrow will bring. It could disappear. There were no guarantees. And in fact, it did. The fact that it did shows that it could have at any time because it was coming from above. It was just by grace, by the good graces of the Big Daddy. Whereas after the flood, when he pulled the plug on the funds, and then the world now was refined, and the world and nature, not only the people, but the world itself, by putting it in that proverbial mikveh, it now became solidified. It's a solid place. God says it's going to run its course. It will never falter. It will never be any surprises. You're not going to have changes in the seasons. There's going to be day, there's going to be night, there's going to be winter, summer, spring, fall. The sun will always rise in the east and settle in the west. The world will run its course. Nature now came into its own, so to speak. Of course, we know it's run by Hashem every single second. But nature now came into its own. It's standing on its own feet. It is a real thing. It's solid. So like that child after the Rockefeller pulled the plug on the funds and put him into business school or whatever and trained him to make his own living. He's going to make a much lesser living, but it's going to be solid and predictable. It'll always be there. Similarly, post-flood, we see those two sides. On the one hand, the blessings are a lot less. Nobody lived 1,000 years. They were cut down to size right away. Hundreds of years less. They lived 500 years, 400, 300, and before you know it, life was reduced to 120 years, 180 years. That was the numbers of those days. So on the one hand, the riches, the blessing, the bounty went down. He's starting from scratch, starting in the mailroom. On the other hand, though, the world was a firm place, as evident in the fact the world can never again be destroyed till the end of time. God made a covenant. And what does it mean that God made a covenant? God strengthened the world to such a point that it will never change. It's indicated that it has the world will never cease to do its cycle. And that's an embodiment of the fact that Hashem never changes, so to speak. Hashem gave the world, empowered the world, that the world itself should be a solid place, and it now becomes firm. And also morally, it was the same two sides. Pre-flood, because the entire creation was just by grace of Hashem, the morality of the people and their identification with Hashem and with truth and with goodness was also by grace of Hashem. There were many righteous people. Everybody was righteous. They all were like probably prophets. Until they weren't. They did one sin, they sunk. There was no return. There was no possibility of tshuva. There was no concept of tshuva pre-flood. Because there was no spiritual immune system. God forbid, without an immune system, a person can get a little cold, the tiniest thing, and it's just a matter of time and he's gone. Because you might be very strong, but it's not, you are not strong. You happen to not be sick yet. So the person of pre-flood, because everything was by the bounty of Hashem, the blessings of life, and the awareness of Hashem, which is because of revelation. So you lived 1,000 years, you were a prophet, you were holy, you were wonderful, until you expose yourself to sin, boom, you're done. And ultimately, the entire planet was sinners. Because why not? How not? Once Hashem immersed the world in the mikveh, in my foolish analogy, my little silly analogy, I pulled the plug on the funds and put him through the rigmarole of business school, of refining the world, of fixing the world, or whatever it means, the time that he spent in the ark, where the world had to be purified and transformed. Now, there's no bounty coming from above so much. The world has taken shape. Nature has become confirmed. And morality has taken shape a little bit. The world doesn't mean we can never sin, but we can do tshuva. The world, humanity, just like nature, the physical nature became confirmed to run its course. Humanity within nature gained some sense of character. that they have a soul. They can be good. They can also be bad, but they can fix it. It's about them. It's the ball's in their court. They can do good. They can mess up. They can mess up terribly. They can fix. They can be very, very good. They can go up and down. But it's about them. They are growing or falling or returning. Whereas pre-flood had nothing to do with that. They were just spectators, enjoying the great show until they dropped the ball on it. So therefore, we now understand the two phases of pre-flood and post-flood. Pre-flood being top-down grace, bounty from the rich daddy. You got all this riches, but it has nothing to do with you really, and therefore, whereas post-flood, it's bottom-up, and hence the changes of these two phases. Whereas in the first one, people lived for a very long time. But on the other hand, the world was a very insecure place, and we don't know what tomorrow could bring. Proof is that tomorrow it did become totally wiped out. Post-flood, the people were not living so long at all. But conversely, it was a place that is secure. And the same thing is spiritually. Pre-flood, they were very, very righteous and very holy, so long as they didn't fail once. But when they did fail once, they were done with. And therefore, there was no point in keeping them around. You had to transform the world through the mikvah and come to phase two, where there's a concept of the spiritual immune system, etc., and teshuva. And therefore, and now the world is ready to run its course morally and physically. And these two phases are an introduction and a precursor to Sinai, which is phase 3, which will be a combo, a marriage of these two, because that's what Hashem really wants. Ultimately, He wants to give us the full bounty, which all comes to fruition when Mashiach comes, but it begins in a real way at Sinai. What is the bounty? Torah and mitzvahs, which is God's infinite wisdom and infinite holiness as infinity. But He gives it to people, and He gives it to them in an integrated way, where it's not just some big divine light, but it actually becomes part of our physicality. And that's why we see by Abraham and Sarah, Avram and Sarah, the first Jews who begin this process, leading up to Sinai as the first Jews, we see in the context of the earlier discussion of longevity versus lack thereof of the first two phases. What happened with Abraham and Sarah? They had a combination of those two formula. On the one hand, they did not have longevity as pre-flood. They lived Abraham lived 175 years, Sarah even less, which was basically the normal lifespan post-flood. Conversely, though, when it came to childbirth, they gave birth at the age of 190, respectively, meaning the age of pre-flood. So these two opposites are really showing that they're exact combination, or an indication that they're an exact combination of the two eras. So this gives us a little bit of a model of what's going on. It's not just random, make a flood, then promise never to make a flood. No, there's a whole model. We're trying to lead up to that combination of heaven and earth. And therefore we have phase 1 where heaven reigns supreme, phase 2 where earth reigns supreme, and phase 3 where they come together. It's manifest in the difference of longevity in the first two phases, and with Avraham and Sarah combining those two elements, as we just mentioned. It's also evident in the difference of the strength of the world in the first phase versus the second, the strength of nature and the strength of that nature will really stand. And it's also evident in the morality of the world. In the first phase, the morality is at a very high level until someone does the first sin. In the second phase, the morality there's some sense of character, and the world is starting to mature, and the concept of teshuvah and etc. This explains, now that we understand this model. So first of all, we answer our question, why Hashem decided to make a flood and then promised never to do it again. Because the world had to go through that process to come to that second phase and to be purified and to mature. So before it came to that second phase, it needed the flood. But after it came to that phase, it never needs it again. It doesn't need a flood. It just needs an opportunity to do teshuvah. It also explains why after God made the promise that he'll never again do it, is that's when he made a covenant that he'll never do it. He also vowed and set into motion that the seasons will never falter. Lo yishbaisu. Nature will always run its course. Why so? Aha! Because nature now became a thing. Nature has matured. It's come into itself. There is something called nature. The world is real. And if it's real, it'll do what it does. Day after day, year after year, season after season. It will never cease till the end of time. This also explains a very fascinating thing about the rainbow, which the rainbow, Torah says, is the sign of God's covenant that will never again destroy the world. And the Rebbe says that in many commentaries and sources, they discuss how can this be a covenant. The rainbow is a natural phenomenon. If there's sunlight and it shines through the clouds in a certain fashion, you have the rainbow. So how can we say that this is a covenant that God made, a special sign? It's not a miraculous concept. That's a sign. It's a natural reality. And it must have existed seemingly before the flood. So what are you saying? No, it wasn't before the flood. It only came now. But it's natural. So what happened before the flood when the sun hit the clouds? How is this a sign? And the Rebbe brings some sources that the world was refined through the flood, physically. And therefore, only post-flood will the clouds reflect the rainbow. Pre-flood, they won't. The sun hitting the clouds is very much analogous of Hashem's light and humanity. Exactly the model we're talking about. It's top down and bottom up. We're trying to connect heaven and earth. So the sun is analogous to Hashem. The verse says, Shemesh u'magen Hashem Elokim. God is compared as analogous to the sun, to the sunlight. It shines down its light. The clouds are analogous of human effort. The clouds come from the mist that rises up from the earth. And then the two merge and you create a rainbow. Pre-flood, there was no rainbow. And why not? Because those clouds were too coarse. They were too unrefined. Exactly like we said in the analog, that in the first era, pre-flood, while God's light was in abundance, in great abundance, almost limitless abundance, hence the great longevity, etc. The world was not refined at all. The world was just eating off the bounty. And therefore, in the analogy of the cloud were physically not refined enough to reflect the sunlight and create some kind of prism of a rainbow. It just bounced right off. Post-flood, where we say the world started to elevate itself physically in the rainbow relationship of the cloud to the sun, the cloud was purified enough and refined enough that when sunlight hit it, it would create a gorgeous rainbow. That was a physical change because the world was refined in all of its particles, including the clouds. And this is not just another particle, but it's a pivotal thing. It's a reflective. It is indicative of man's relationship with Hashem, the world's relationship with its creator. The world was refined. The world was elevated. The world was solidified. The child went and got a job. So when the light shone, the world reflected a gorgeous rainbow. And therefore, if that's the case, the Rebbe is borrowing from these commentary and giving it further insight. That's the case. So it makes sense that there was no rainbow prior, and there is now, even though it's a natural phenomenon. Yeah, it's a natural phenomenon now that nature is refined. And therefore, it is a sign that God will never destroy the world, because why won't God destroy the world? Because the world doesn't need to be destroyed, because the world is refined. The world does have a spiritual immune system. It doesn't need to be destroyed. It just needs to give opportunity, to be given opportunity for teshuvah, which it has been given. The worst sinner can return post-flood. Proof is, take a look at the rainbow. Look how refined nature is. Look how refined the bottom guy is, the little guy is, in that cloud now reflects the sunlight. It's become refined, and therefore there's no need for a flood, and therefore the rainbow is not just some magical sign. Hey, God made a beautiful rainbow to say, I'll be a nice guy, I'll never kill you again. No, I'll never do it because there's no need. It's been accomplished. The world has been refined in a fundamental way that it is potentially capable of tshuva and of self-betterment. It has matured into itself in a way that it can always rise up again, and therefore there's no point in destruction. This explains also a separate concept, which I believe is brought in the footnotes. It is brought in the footnotes that there's a concept that pre-flood they weren't allowed to eat meat. They were all vegetarian. Post-flood, we were allowed to eat meat. Pre-flood, Adam and Eve were told you can eat vegetation. Post-flood, meat. Like, why is he giving them another diet? Why do they deserve a reward for destroying the world with their sins? So the Rebbe explains, there's a principle that Amaretz Asar Lachol Basar. An igdaram is a boor, a person who's not involved in Torah and in mitzvahs and in finer things, is not allowed to eat meat. And why not? Because what right do you have to take that other life and eat it? Only if you're a higher level person. And by eating the animal, you'll eat it and use its energy for mitzvahs and for higher things. You're actually doing the animal's spark a favor because you're elevating it. But that's only true if you're a high level person. And that's why pre-flood, they weren't allowed to eat meat because the world was all a low level. Remember, whatever they had in terms of their bounty and their blessing and their spirituality was all gifted, but they were like rock bottom. So how could they eat meat? Post-flood, even if today they may be behaving rock bottom, but fundamentally the world has been refined. It's been stepped up a quantum notch of refinement, and therefore the concept of meat was allowed. Because now there's some hope that we can elevate the meat, and thereby we're elevating its sparks, and thereby we actually sort of have a right to do it, and we're not doing the animal a disfavor in a sense. So this explains this explains the questions we had about the flood. A, why God made a flood and changed his mind, and B, how the rainbow is a valid sign. C, why the world seems stronger and yet weaker post-flood, stronger that it's solid and predictable, and with the seasons and everything, and weaker, people live a lot shorter because of the shift of these steps. Phase 1, top down, phase 2, bottom up, phase 3, the combination of both. And we also explained it in the context of the life of Abraham and Sarah, living shorter lives and yet giving birth at the age of the pre-flood, bringing home the combination of both. Now, let's come in for the home stretch. Now that we understand a little bit what the flood is about, and that there was those 3 phases, pre-flood, post-flood, leading up to Sinai, which is a combination of both those messages. Now let's talk about Shabbos. Shabbos was a gift that God embedded into creation, right at the beginning of creation, which is really a taste of heaven. Why so? God's creating the world in 6 days. He's flowing the energy. Shabbos, he stops. Like, how could he? He's running the world. And the answer is because God wanted the world to have a taste of beyond world. In the language of the Talmud, it says when God finished 6 days of creation, the world was complete. But no, God said there's something missing. And what is it missing? It's missing menucha. It's missing rest. What does it really mean? And Shabbos brought rest. What does it mean that it's rest? He brought rest. Rest is something that you bring. Rest is an absence of something. What it really means is rest here doesn't mean an absence of work. Rest means the world's purpose, the beyond the world, the divinity, the heaven. So if the purpose of the first 2 phases was to introduce heaven and then to introduce earth and then to combine them, Hashem laid the groundwork for that right at the beginning of creation. The 6 days of creation, he made earth, he made the world. On Shabbos, he introduced into the world the heaven. He introduced into earth also heaven, which that is what Shabbos is. It's not a day not to work. It's a day to experience rest, which really means serenity, purpose. It's been said that on the rest of the week you do, and Shabbos you are. It's about the beyond. It's about the purpose of it all. It's about Hashem. And therefore, really, you might say the 6 days of the week versus Shabbos is heaven versus earth versus heaven, etc. And therefore, Hashem put Shabbos into the story of creation to lay the groundwork for Sinai. But there's going to come a special people. the Jewish people, to create that bridge between heaven and earth, to create that bridge between those first two phases. And how will the Jewish people do it? Because the Jewish people really are a shatchet. They're a matchmaker between heaven and earth, because on the one hand, we have a body that's human. On the other hand, we have a neshama that's literally divine, and we're able to bridge the both. And how do we experience, and ultimately to Mashiach, but how do we experience it, and how do we are empowered to do it? Through Shabbos. With the 6 days of the week, we act like regular human beings. And on Shabbos, we like walk away from nature. We completely step away, because our neshama, that part of us, is beyond nature. And in that way, we're bridging the two. Ultimately, what is Mashiach? It's the perfect Shabbos. And that's why a guy is not supposed to keep Shabbos. Because a guy is the human being of nature. He's part of nature. And just like nature is supposed to continue doing what it's doing, and nature is supposed to be strong and solid before we introduce the combination of heaven into the world, we need the world to be solid. The Gentile starts keeping Shabbos, not just that they're not working, but in the sense of the serenity, in the sense of removing themselves from physicality. That's not their goal. Then they're bringing into question the solidification and the maturity of nature, which is very, very important post-flood. And now it makes perfect sense why that mitzvah, that prohibition, is introduced post-flood. And as soon as the flood takes place, and now the world will graduate from just being a recipient of God's bounty, as it was pre-flood, but the world will now become a solid thing, and nature becomes solid and continuous and predictable. The nations of the world, other than the Jew, human beings, their job is to be part of that world and make sure the world is running strong, and not to run away from it, and not to become meditative and spiritual and otherworldly. They're supposed to be worldly, albeit with the faith in Hashem and the 7 mitzvahs, but they're supposed to be worldly. They're supposed to be solidly rooted here on earth. Don't get too spiritual on us. That's not the goal of humanity. That's not the goal of the world. The goal of the world is to be a solid world, unchanged. Remember, that's the phase 2. And that's why at that moment, God introduced that phase 2 and said, take a look what I did through the flood. The world is now a predictable, solid, cyclical place of seasons, etc., and cycles and systems. He says at that same moment to the nations, stay firmly rooted on that earth. Make sure the earth is solid. Make sure nature is solid. Make sure human beings are doing what they got to do to be part of that world in a meaningful and a moral way, but very much part of that world. Don't let them run away to heaven. Don't start Shabbosing me. That's contrary. That's like nature having occasional miracles popping up. That's contrary to that command that God said to the world, I want you to stick to your season. Do your job. Just be a world. Be a good world. Be a good Gentile. With the 7 laws of Noach. But do your job. Don't try to become an angel army. Whereas a Jew, he has to toggle in both worlds. He's supposed to be very human. If he doesn't work during the 6 weekdays, it's a sin. It's considered to be a mitzvah to work 6 days, just like resting on Shabbos. Conversely, he's got to have Shabbos. We're supposed to be, I guess, a human and an angel. Our job is to be in both worlds, to be on earth and be in heaven. But that's our job. That's why we're a little beshigah. Our very definition is a combination of opposites. But that's the Jewish condition. That's the Jewish contribution. We're the shatchet of Hashem in the world, and because of who we are, because of our source and what have you. But for Gentile, it's the exact opposite of their purpose. Okay, if you look at the terms of takeaway, I mean, there's many, many takeaways in this Sicha. One is that you see that life and death is all about purpose. I could be living a wonderful life, but if I'm not living my purpose, that's death. A Jew not keeping Shabbos, or conversely, a Gentile running to keep Shabbos, that's death. It's not purpose. Also, by the way, you don't have to worry that your Christian neighbors or your Muslim neighbors who observe Sunday or Friday are liable for death penalty, because to my understanding, they're not really keeping Shabbos in the spiritual sense. They're just taking it as they're not keeping the 39 laws, and therefore it's not really such a problem, I think. I'm not sure. I think that they're just taking a day off. The problem is, according to the Sicha, the way we're understanding it, when they become too spiritual and they start making it into a religious holy thing. I don't know, maybe they do call it a religious holy thing, but anyway. The other takeaway is that to understand the plan of the flood and its purpose, and therefore to understand the model of the Jewish people, and there's going to be numerous sikhs coming up in the same volume of the Likutei Sichos, continuing that theme into the patriarchs and to the holy temples, etc. These three steps from the top, from the bottom, and connecting them. And really, this is the Jewish condition, though, the value of Shabbos, of connecting heaven and earth.